Do you know the rules of the old school? The real rules, not the ones in the education board's manual. You don't? Then you're lucky. But now that you're about to hear this story, you too will know the rules. And once you know them, you can never forget them. My name is David Lee, 28 years old. I was in my 5th year as a teacher. 3 months ago, I ignored the 8 rules of the old school. And now, every night at 2:11 a.m., I hear scratching sounds from the walls of my apartment, as if someone is trying to get out from the inside. It all began 3 months ago on a Monday, my first day at the new position. Forced to change jobs due to an incident at my previous school. After months of job hunting, I was desperately clinging to this position I had finally found. The school was old, tall, and had an abandoned appearance, with walls bearing layers upon layers of paint that had seeped in over the years. Walls where new paint had simply been applied over stains that wouldn't scrub off. The classroom I was assigned to was at the end of the hallway, just past the main staircase. The plate next to the door read Room 302. Upon entering, I smelled that scent common to all old classrooms. The smell of dust and chalk that had soaked into the floorboards over decades. Old wooden desks lined the room, some still bearing initials carved by students from long ago. The old clock on the wall pointed to 8:30 a.m. A long day still awaited until dismissal. There was something unsettling in the silence, but I shook it off. I told myself it was just nerves. First days are always strange, especially at a new school. Then the envelope appeared. When I arrived, it was placed neatly on the desk. There was no addressee, just read carefully written in flowing black ink on the front. It was addressed to Mr. Lee, so someone knew of my arrival. I picked up the envelope, tore open the top, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. With the sensation of chalk dust sticking to my fingers, I began to read. Rules for Room 302. Rule 1. Never seat children close to each other. Always leave at least one empty desk between them. Rule 2. If a child stares at you for more than a few seconds, look away and pretend not to notice. Rule 3. If you hear scratching sounds from beneath the floor, ignore them completely. Rule 4. Do not look at the clock between 2:11 p.m. and 2:13 p.m. Rule 5. If a child brings a gift, do not accept it. Politely decline and have them take it home. Rule 6. If a child knocks on the door after the bell has rung, do not respond. Rule 7. If you find a child standing in a corner facing the wall, do not disturb them. They will leave on their own. Rule 8. When the 3:15 p.m. bell rings, leave immediately. Do not stay behind to grade or organize. I read the list again and felt a chill run down my spine. However, I reconsidered it as some kind of initiation prank for new teachers. Every school has ways to test newcomers. I folded the paper and slipped it into my bag. I'd keep it to laugh about later. Then, as if on cue, the door opened and an elderly woman entered. She wore glasses low on her nose and had silver gray hair pulled tightly back. She didn't introduce herself, simply nodded in my direction and pointed to the desk. Her eyes were sharp, and I could tell she had been here for a long time.
You're Mr. Lee?
Her voice was metallic and cold. I nodded. Yes, I came early. I wanted to prepare.
Good. Follow the rules.
She said.
They are not a joke. The previous teacher.
She cut herself off and pressed her lips together tightly.
Just follow the rules.
With that, she left, the door clicking shut behind her. I wanted to laugh, but something stopped me. The way she looked at me, as if she knew of dangers I didn't. That gaze lingered long after she had gone. I noticed my mouth had a metallic taste. I shook it off and returned to preparing the classroom. By the time the bell rang, I was sitting at my desk, pretending to be calm. The students began filing in. They looked normal, like any other children. A bit pale, and yes, quieter than I was used to, but I told myself that was normal. New teacher, new year, nothing unusual. However, I quickly noticed the children's strange habit. No one sat next to each other. They automatically chose seats, spreading out with one desk between them. I didn't even need to remind them. It was as if they knew instinctively. While taking attendance, I felt someone's gaze. Looking up, I met eyes with a female student sitting by the window. Her name tag read Sarah. Her face was expressionless and unreadable, her stare persistent. Her eyes were unusually wide open, never blinking, so intensely focused. I remembered Rule 2. I dropped my gaze to the attendance sheet and gripped my pencil tightly. She was still staring. I could feel it, but I forced myself to keep looking away, scanning the list over and over until I finally felt her look away. When I gathered the courage to look up, her attention was directed at the window again, but there was a faint smile on her lips. An hour passed, and the lesson progressed slowly. I was teaching multiplication tables while trying to gauge their attention. It was surprisingly good. That is, because they didn't fidget. They sat eerily still, watching me with unusual seriousness. Then during silent reading time, I heard it. Scratching sounds. Faint but distinct, coming from beneath the floorboards. I stiffened. I wanted to look down, but Rule 3 came to mind. Ignore them completely. I continued reading aloud, forcing my voice to remain steady. The scratching grew louder, as if something just below us was clawing with sharp nails, trying to break through the floor. The room's temperature seemed to drop suddenly. It was difficult not to react, but I forced myself to focus on the book, hoping the sounds would disappear. The scratching finally stopped. Several children exchanged glances, but no one said a word about it. They returned to their books, and I understood this was routine for them. They had heard those sounds before, many times. I told myself I could get through this day. I just had to follow the rules. During the next activity, I noticed two students, Sarah and Tom, a boy sitting behind her, looking at each other with what seemed like thinly veiled hostility. Tom had unnaturally sharp features, with eyes of a strange, cold gray. Sarah, sitting one desk away, had teeth that appeared slightly pointed, even from where I was sitting. Rule 1. Never seat children close to each other. I was beginning to understand its meaning. I continued watching them, noticing how tense they were. They occasionally glanced at each other, never making obvious movements, but there was something predatory in the way they looked. I felt like I was in a room full of predators, as if they were watching each other, searching for weakness. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. Everyone, it's time to change activities. Please take out your spelling workbooks. The students moved slowly, each pulling out their workbooks from their bags with almost mechanical precision. Tom's cold gaze never left Sarah, and her lips held a slight smile, as if challenging him to do something. I had horrifying thoughts about how close they might have sat last year, what it was like before someone came up with this rule. I decided to walk around the room to ease the tension. As I passed by their desks, I noticed something disturbing. Sarah's chair back had claw marks, deep scratches carved into the wood. Tom's chair was similarly covered with deeper, more numerous scars. Looking down, I could see that both had faint scars on their arms, though hidden by their long-sleeved uniforms. healing scratch marks. I realized they were both watching me, their eyes glinting sharply and alertly. Without warning, I pretended to be interested in the next student's workbook instead, feeling their gazes follow me with my back. Lunch passed without major incident. I took my break alone, eating a sandwich at my desk while trying to act normal despite the morning's strange events. But the food had no taste. I kept glancing at the clock, being careful of the time. I didn't want to accidentally look at the wrong moment, but there was a strange, curious itch about what would happen if I looked between 2:11 and 2:13. As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. It was the same elderly woman who had met me this morning. Her voice was clear and flat, not greeting me or asking how my day was going. She simply said,
"Don't forget the rules."
Then the line went dead. The rest of the day crawled forward. Each minute brought me closer to that dreaded time. I had cleared the first 3 rules without much trouble, but I had to admit I had never been this nervous in my life. I tried not to look at the clock, and the children, for their part, seemed indifferent, as if they had danced this dance countless times. But only Sarah and Tom occasionally looked my way with expectant expressions. Then at exactly 2:10 p.m., I looked away from the clock and resolved never to look. I looked around the room trying to focus on something else, but something was fundamentally wrong. The room seemed quieter. I couldn't explain it, but the usual rustling, the sound of pages turning, all of it had disappeared. Looking up, the children sat motionless, eyes fixed on their desks as if waiting for something. I couldn't even hear breathing. I counted seconds in my head, my pulse racing, wondering what would happen if I had the courage to look at the clock. But the thought of breaking the rule pinned me to my chair, and I fixed my eyes on the wall above the students' heads. The silence was oppressive, growing thicker with each tick of the audible but invisible second hand. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life. Then, at exactly 2:13 p.m., the silence broke and the children began moving again as if nothing had happened. I slowly exhaled, shaken but relieved. I had followed the rule. Nothing happened. I had gotten through the worst part. So I thought. But the relief didn't last long. As the clock hands continued their quiet progress, the classroom air began to grow heavy again. Around 2:45 p.m., I came to know of the existence of the 5th rule. A female student holding a doll approached my desk once again. In her eyes dwelt the same unfathomable deep shadows as before. The doll gripped in her hands was even more aged than the one I had seen yesterday. The fabric's color had faded, the hair was tangled, and fine cracks telling of time's passage were etched into the small face. The sound of her approaching footsteps was somehow different from those of the other students. An eerily light resonance, as if her feet weren't touching the floor. As the classroom's fluorescent light streamed in over her shoulder, only the doll's shadow fell distinctly upon the desk, darker and clearer than a human shadow.
"Teacher, please accept this."
Her voice was small like a whisper, yet it resonated strangely clearly in the classroom silence. The doll's head swayed slightly, as if it were shaking its head. Without any wind, the doll's hair fluttered faintly. There was that peculiar hesitation one feels when receiving a gift, especially when that gift is clearly inappropriate and instinct shows a rejection response. My hand naturally stiffened upon the desk, my gaze fixed upon the doll's hollow-like eyes. I thought I saw something faintly glimmer in the depths of those eyes. Having learned from my experience with the 4th rule, I read the classroom's atmosphere more sensitively this time. At that moment, a low cough came from the rear of the classroom. Looking back, I saw a male student with gray eyes staring at me. His expression held a clear warning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. At the same time, I could see his mouth silently conveying something. He seemed to be saying, "Don't." I took a deep breath and answered in as gentle a voice as possible. "Thank you, but I can't accept it today. Let's try again another time." The female student's expression distorted slightly for a moment. Rather than disappointment, it was some other emotion. Understanding, or perhaps relief? For an instant, I thought I saw human-like warmth return to her eyes, as if she had reclaimed something that had been lost for a long time. She quietly nodded, re-embraced the doll to her chest, and returned to her seat. Her retreating figure looked as if she were carrying a heavy burden. As she walked, I could hear her whispering something to the doll. It sounded like an apology, or perhaps comfort. A small voice. Silence returned to the classroom. However, the quality of that silence was different from before, as if all the students were holding their breath, waiting for something. The air itself seemed to have grown heavy, and the usually unnoticeable sound of the wall clock's second hand resonated like a drum. I opened my desk drawer and found a folded piece of paper. Something that shouldn't have been there yesterday had appeared once again. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been written decades ago. Rule 5. Never accept gifts from students. Especially avoid dolls, photographs, and letters at all costs. Once you accept them, you become part of their world. My hand trembled slightly. Who had placed this paper here? And why had I come here without knowing these rules? The preliminary briefing from the personnel department had contained no such precautions, as if they had been intentionally hidden. Around 3 p.m., the classroom's atmosphere became even more oppressive. At first, I didn't notice. I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision, but when I turned around, there was nothing. However, the students' behavior had clearly changed. They were all uniformly tense, their postures at their desks more rigid. Not one of them would look to the left side, as if they were collectively avoiding something. And then I saw it. In the left rear corner of the classroom, a student was standing, back turned to the classroom, face toward the wall. That student's uniform was the same as the others, but something was fundamentally different. As if the outline was blurred, the presence was ambiguous. Occasionally, the outline seemed to waver, as if it were in air distorted by heat. Observing more carefully, I noticed that the student had no shadow at their feet. Despite being under the fluorescent lights, no shadow fell on the floor, and only the air around that student appeared slightly faded. I tried to stand up. A teacher's instinct wouldn't allow me to overlook a student's abnormal behavior. However, the gray-eyed male student looked at me again and clearly shook his head this time. Fear was clearly visible in his expression. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his usually calm hands trembled minutely on the desk. The conflict of overlooking a student's abnormal behavior as a teacher was more painful than I had imagined. Professional responsibility and inexplicable fear clashed violently within my heart. I reached for my desk drawer. There was a new piece of paper there. The ink appeared to still be wet, and the paper retained a faint warmth. Rule 7. Never speak to students standing in corners. Do not look at them. They are no longer residents of this world. As the clock's hands approached 4 p.m., the classroom's tension reached its peak. The student standing in the corner was still there, motionless, continuing to stand facing the wall. Occasionally, I could see their shoulders trembling minutely, but I couldn't tell if they were crying or if it was for some other reason. In sync with that trembling, the classroom's temperature seemed to drop slightly. I continued preparing for class while desperately maintaining composure. However, my hands trembling wouldn't stop. and I couldn't put strength into my fingers holding the chalk. The letters I wrote on the blackboard were distorted, only half their usual size. Mathematical formulas that I could usually write easily had to be rewritten multiple times. Not one student would look toward the corner, as if collectively ignoring that presence had become an unspoken understanding. This coordinated ignoring was unnaturally frightening. However, the perfection of that coordination told the story that this had been repeated daily. They were accustomed to it, to this abnormal situation. The dismissal bell rang. At the same moment as that sound, something strange happened. The students' expressions all brightened at once, as if they had been released from a heavy curse. The tension up until then vanished like a lie, and they regained the expressions of ordinary high school students. At that moment, the student who had been standing in the corner disappeared, literally as if they had never been there in the first place. I rubbed my eyes and stared at the corner again, but there was nothing there. Only the air in that spot seemed slightly distorted. The students began quietly packing their belongings. However, their movements were mechanical, as if they were being controlled by something. The gray-eyed male student stood in front of my desk.
Teacher, you did well today. But from tomorrow, be more careful.
His voice carried a weight inappropriate for his age, and as he left, he added quietly,
Everyone hopes that you'll remain safe, teacher.
The next morning, I stood frozen in front of the door to room 302. I hadn't slept a wink the night before. The gray-eyed male student's warning, the inexplicable disappearance of the student who had been standing in the corner, and the rule papers that kept appearing in my desk drawer. Everything was surreal, yet I had certainly experienced it all. I woke up multiple times during the night, checking to see if anyone was standing in the corners of my room. Upon entering the classroom, I immediately felt something was wrong. Something was missing. The seating arrangement was the same as yesterday, the desk arrangement unchanged. However, the quality of the air was different. The faint electrical current of tension that I had felt until yesterday was gone. And then I realized. The gray-eyed male student wasn't there. His seat was empty, with nothing placed on the desk, as if no one had ever sat there from the beginning. The desk's surface had not a speck of dust, and the chair was aligned with the others. However, that perfection was unnaturally strange. There were no traces of use whatsoever. I checked the student roster. The name of the student who had certainly existed yesterday had disappeared. I flipped through the pages and checked multiple times, but his record had vanished without a trace. The roster's print date remained yesterday's, yet it was as if he had never existed from the beginning. The other students sat as if nothing had happened. However, their gazes were subtly avoidant, and they seemed even more tense than yesterday. Several students glanced at the empty seat for a moment, then hurriedly averted their eyes. I remembered the elderly administrative woman. She must know something, and she was the only one who might tell me the truth. When I opened my desk drawer, there was a new piece of paper. This time the writing was clearer, as if it had been written just last night. The faint smell of ink lingered. Rule 8. If a student disappears, never mention that fact. Do not ask questions. They have paid the price for issuing warnings. If you wish to avoid being the next to disappear, maintain silence. Below that, in different handwriting, a hurried note was added. He tried to protect you until the end. Please don't let his will be in vain. From the predecessor, my blood froze. The gray-eyed male student had continued sending me warnings. To refuse accepting the doll, to ignore the student in the corner. And now he was gone. He had paid the price to protect me. The despair felt when someone who helped you suddenly disappears is indescribable. especially when you understand that their disappearance was to protect you. The overwhelming loneliness, the guilt welling up from deep in my chest mixed with feelings of gratitude with nowhere to go, making me feel suffocated. I looked around the classroom. Among the remaining students, was there anyone with whom I could communicate like him? The female student holding the doll continued to stare at me as always, but there was something different in her eyes from yesterday. Expectation? Or perhaps pity? And I noticed that several students sitting behind her wore similar expressions. The morning class was like a nightmare. My voice trembled, and the letters I wrote on the blackboard were so distorted they were unreadable. And every time I looked at the disappeared student seat, I felt my chest tighten. During lunch break, I searched for the elderly administrator. She was in the basement management room. In the dimly lit room, she was organizing something while surrounded by old documents. She didn't turn around even when she heard my footsteps, as if she had anticipated my visit. The room's air was old, mixed with the smell of dust and paper accumulated over many years.
About yesterday's student.
Her voice was quiet but filled with conviction. The male student with gray eyes. He
wasn't here.
She interrupted my words.
From the beginning, such a student never existed.
I was at a loss for words. However, there was no sign of lying in her expression. Rather, there was deep sadness. The heavy fatigue of someone who had carried the secret for many years lingered.
Teacher, you need to know the truth about room 302. That classroom is a special place. Room 302 is one of the oldest classrooms in this school, and sometimes those who cannot yet remain in this world appear there. They try to send warnings to the living. However, that act comes with a price.
Her words were heavy, colder than the classroom's air, and she stood up, taking an old file from the shelf.
So far, 17 teachers have been in charge of room 302. Of those, only 3 were able to continue for more than a year. The rest
She trailed off.
went missing or had mental breakdowns. You are the 18th.
Were they the ones who taught me the rules?
Yes. Wisdom passed down from predecessors for survival. And sometimes warnings from benevolent souls who appear are included.
Survival. That word froze my heart. That afternoon, I left school early. The class in room 302 was a disaster. I couldn't concentrate, and I felt like all the students' gazes were seeing through my anxiety. The female student with the doll stared at me all day, occasionally turning the doll's head toward me. At the end of class, I noticed she was trying to convey something by moving her lips, but I couldn't read it. When getting into my car, I looked back at the school building. I saw a figure in the window of room 302 on the 3rd floor. It was the student who had been standing in the corner. This time they stood by the window, looking down at the schoolyard. Their figure was clearer than yesterday, and I noticed there was another figure beside them. It was the gray-eyed male student. He was staring at me, seemingly sending a final warning. I hurriedly started the engine. When I checked the school building in the rearview mirror, there was no one at the window. While driving, the administrator's words continued echoing in my head. For survival, wisdom passed down from predecessors. The 18th. This meant there had been teachers in room 302 before, and something had happened to most of them. Of 17 people, only 3 were safe. Considering those odds made my spine chill. The road home felt longer than usual. Every time I stopped at a traffic light, I checked the rearview mirror, driven by the delusion that someone might be following me. I thought I occasionally saw figures reflected in the passenger window, but when I turned around, there was nothing. However, What was truly terrifying was that these might not be delusions. Even after arriving home, I couldn't shake the day's events from my head. The administrator's words, the disappeared student, and the fact that I had to return to room 302 tomorrow. I had a premonition that this nightmare would continue until I knew all the remaining rules, weighing heavily in my chest. But waiting for answers wouldn't change anything. That night, I, David, resolved myself. At 2 a.m., David quietly infiltrated through the school's back gate. As the flashlight beam cut through the corridor, only his footsteps echoed in the silence. The school building, wrapped in a completely different atmosphere from daytime, felt like another world entirely. On his way to room 302, he stopped at a corner in the hallway. This was where Jacob always stood. But now, no one was there. Remembering Rule 7, their power weakens at night, he let out a sigh of relief. In that moment, he heard footsteps from behind. Turning around, Emily stood there holding a doll. In the darkness of night, her face appeared to glow pale blue.
Mr. David, why are you here?
Her voice was lower than during the day, somehow mechanical. The doll's eyes reflected the flashlight beam, glinting as if alive. You tell me, why are you at school in the middle of the night? Emily smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile.
We're always here, day and night. But tonight is special.
As she readjusted her grip on the doll, Emily's expression briefly contorted.
It's almost time. Everything will be revealed in room 302. You two must make a choice.
The moment David tried to ask a question, Emily's figure began to fade. Like mist, she dissolved into the darkness. Wait, but his voice was only absorbed into the empty corridor. All that remained was a small piece of paper the doll had dropped. With trembling hands, he picked it up to find 40 minutes until 3 a.m. written on it. With his heart pounding faster, David rushed toward room 302. Emily's words echoed in his mind.
You must make a choice.
What choice exactly? The moment he opened the door to room 302, David gasped. The scene before him was completely different from the familiar classroom he knew during the day. Photos were pasted on the wallpaper, all pictures of students, but upon closer inspection, the same faces appeared repeatedly across many years. Photos of Emily, Jacob, and the other students from the 1950s to the present, looking exactly the same. However, their expressions were subtly different, as if despair had deepened with the passage of time. New rules were written on the blackboard. Rule 9. Those who learn the truth must make a choice. Rule 10. The time of choice is 3 a.m. Decide before then. Looking at the clock, it was 2:45 a.m. Emily's note had been accurate. Only 15 minutes remained. A notebook lay on the desk. The cover read, Record of Room 302. Turning the pages revealed records of past teachers. 1952 teacher John Smith, refused choice, missing. 1967 teacher Mary Johnson, accepted, still enrolled. 1985 teacher Robert Wilson, refused choice, memory erased, transferred. On the last page, today's date and David's name were already written. Below there were two choices, accept or refuse. He heard footsteps behind him, slowly turning around.
Surprised, Mr. David?
The elderly female administrator stood there. However, her appearance was vastly different from during the day. Her skin was translucently white, and her eyes were as black as deep darkness. What exactly are you?
I am the guardian of this school, and like a mother figure to those children.
As she spoke, the classroom air grew heavy. Mist-like thin shadows flickered, gradually taking shape. The figures of Emily, Jacob, and the other students appeared at the back of the classroom. They stood quietly, gazing at David with sorrowful eyes.
They are students who died in an accident in 1950, in a fire that occurred at this school. I was a teacher at the time. On the day of the fire, I had left early, if I had been there. So I offered my soul to keep them in this world.
What about Michael Green?
He learned the truth and refused to choose. We erased his memory, but part of his soul remained here. The student Michael during the day is an illusion created by fragments of his soul.
The clock showed 2:58 a.m. 2 minutes remaining.
You have two choices. Stay here with us and become the teacher of room 302 for eternity, or forget everything and leave.
David's heart was in turmoil. Looking at the students before him, their expressions mixed loneliness with hope.
Teacher, stay with us.
Jacob spoke for the first time.
We need a teacher.
Emily said while hugging her doll. The clock showed 2:59 a.m. David took a deep breath. His sense of duty as a teacher battled with his human longing for freedom. Wait! He looked into the students' faces as he addressed the administrator. Look at their eyes. It's not fear. They're seeking peace. Isn't there a third choice? The administrator's expression changed.
A third choice?
Let them rest in peace. For 70 years, you may have thought you were saving them, but weren't you actually binding them? The students stirred. However, relief showed in their eyes.
That is?
The administrator showed a confused expression.
I never considered that.
The three and Belle told. David made his decision. I will liberate them. And you too.
How?
The administrator asked in a trembling voice. David stood in front of the blackboard and picked up chalk. I'll create a new rule. As Rule 11, he began writing on the blackboard. Rule 11. With love and gratitude, permission is granted to depart in peace. The moment he finished writing, the classroom was enveloped in warm light. The students' figures slowly became transparent.
Thank you, Mr. David.
Emily smiled. The doll dissolved into the light along with her.
We can finally be free.
Jacob's face showed peace. The other students disappeared into the light one by one, each leaving words of gratitude. Finally, the administrator spoke.
Thank you. I too had long regretted binding them. But that wasn't salvation, it was the beginning of new suffering. Finally, we can move forward.
Her figure was also enveloped in light and disappeared. The classroom was wrapped in silence. All the rules on the blackboard vanished, and it returned to an ordinary classroom. David shed tears as he gazed at the sunrise through the window. 3 months later, David was working as a teacher at a new school. The events of room 302 felt like a dream, but the small photograph in his chest pocket proved it had been real. The photograph had appeared naturally in the fading light that morning, like a final gift from them. It showed the students and administrators smiling in the light. On the back, in childish handwriting, was written, "Thank you." His colleagues at the new school found it strange that David would sometimes look up at the sky and smile, but he never explained. One day, he found a small article in the newspaper. Former St. John's High School scheduled for demolition and reconstruction. David smiled. Room 302 and those rules were no longer needed. All souls had departed for a peaceful place. In the evening, looking up at the sky, warm light streamed through the clouds. In that light, he thought he could see the smiling faces of Emily, Jacob, and the other students. "Thank you, everyone," David whispered softly. The wind caressed his cheek. It seemed to carry feelings of gratitude.